welcome to session 2 on quadratics. In today's video, we're going to be focusing on solving quadratic equations. Now that you've picked up the basic understanding of what a quadratic expression is, today we're going to be focusing on the things that we do to solve equations involving quadratics. So today, we're going to look at the different methods, and by the time we end this session, you should be able to recall the methods of solving quadratic equations and hopefully develop an appreciation for the various approaches to solving quadratics. When we solve quadratics, we have several approaches that we can take, and in today's lesson, essentially, I want you to be able to understand that there's some approaches which might be more appropriate at a specific time, or it may be required. So it's important for us to know the different methods as well as know how to do them effectively. The three main techniques that we're going to be looking at for solving quadratic equations involve factorization, we have quadratic formula, and one that we call the completion of squares technique. When we solve using factorization, there are some important points that we need to know about, and factorization technique employs some of our prior knowledge in algebra and number theory. So we should know that factorization, it requires an understanding of distributive law. We also need to understand how to identify factors. That's the root of the whole process of factorization. You need to be able to identify factors because we use a technique in factorization of quadratics which involves highest common factor. It measures our understanding of the techniques of factorization by grouping and highest common factor. We also need to know all the things that we talked about from our last lesson, where we identify coefficients and constants in our quadratic expressions. Directed numbers will play a very important role in this particular technique. It's very important for us to understand that algebra is hinging on our understanding of directed numbers. A second technique using the quadratic formula will also require us to do things like perform arithmetic with directed numbers, recognize coefficients and constants in our quadratic expression. When we deal with the quadratic formula, there's a very specific formula that we are going to be using, and some people are able to memorize it really well, recall it quite easily, and then probably for those of us who find it a bit too much, just know that it's available for you on your formula sheet on your CXC exam paper. When we work with the quadratic formula, something else that will be a perfect asset for absolutely any math student who wants to be able to work this out quite easily, using your calculator. When you are doing mathematics, obviously your calculator is in fact a tool that can help you with being able to double check yourself, but for those of us who lack that confidence in our abilities to perform arithmetic on our own, our calculator is going to be very handy and very important so that we can actually compute all these difficult, challenging things and work it out accurately. So we've looked at factorization and quadratic formula, what these particular methods involve. Now let's talk about the completion of square method. When we work with this particular technique, we need to understand distributive law as well, because when we are starting off this technique, it involves a bit of factorization. Once you understand how to do the techniques like factorization by grouping and highest common factor, you'll be able to begin your process to complete the square quite easily. This technique also requires you to be able to identify your constants and coefficients in a quadratic expression, which is one of the reasons our very first session is such an important lesson to understand properly. So if you still have challenges understanding how to recognize your coefficients and constants, I would recommend you take a look at that first lesson again. When working with the completion of square method, you need to be able to recognize perfect squares. There's a specific format that we are always working towards expressing our quadratic in. It's called Vertex Notation, and in that particular notation, you can tell various properties of your quadratic just by looking at that form. We'll talk about using this form to identify certain properties of our quadratic when we deal with the functions aspect of this quadratic expression. And then here we'll also find that using our calculator is going to be quite handy because there are some cumbersome little bits that we have to work out at times, and if you just can't seem to wrap your head around it, doing it manually, might as well just be able to do it properly on your calculator and get your answer with ease. Just for the purpose of illustrating what these types of questions can look like on the exam, I have 3 examples. So your very first encounter with quadratics on your exam paper will be inevitably around a question 2 where you have to do factorization. They will ask you to factorize, and this obviously requires you to be able to use the factorization technique. Sometimes later down in the paper, whether it is involved in an application question or in the functions question itself, they will ask you to solve for x in a quadratic, and this will also require you to know your different techniques. You can use factorization or quadratic formula as the case may be. There's some instances where it's much better to use your quadratic formula because you can't solve the quadratic by factorization. And then finally, we have these questions, which usually will come in your second section. And in this particular type of questions, they will ask you to express a quadratic in the Vertex Notation and identify certain properties of your quadratic. So this will bridge over into functions, and being able to identify properties will enable you to put this all together on a nice little sketch of your quadratic graph. So these are just some illustrations just for you to understand what these particular techniques can be tested like on the exam, and we are going to look at each of these techniques individually. So if you would like to understand any one in particular, you can just skip across to one of those videos. But if you would like to do a complete review from beginning to end with being able to solve quadratics, feel free to stick around for all 3 videos. Alright, so these are the 3 techniques that we use for solving quadratics, and if you can recall the 3 specific techniques we talked about, then you're good to go from today's session. And hopefully talking about the 3 different techniques can help you garner some level of appreciation for knowing that there are multiple approaches to solving quadratics. Did you enjoy this particular session? If you did, be sure to leave a thumbs up and share with your friends as you guys prepare to write CXC exams. Be sure to tune in for future videos as we continue our masterclass series in quadratics. Thanks for watching.